let the bodies pile high in their thousands. Like, that's a Shakespearean line.
Just never something you want to hear from a modern day Western leader. Any leader. To be really honest, it's just not something you want to hear. Hello and welcome to The Big Con, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and simplifying the world of strategy, exploring its impact on the businesses and individuals who've either harnessed it for success or perhaps missed the mark. I'm Dale, big business nerd and content aficionado.
And I'm Emily, Harvard degree candidate.
We are bringing you in on The Con, sharing the valuable lessons from both the failures and the triumphs of those who've come before us. Emily, we have a long-form episode today.
Yes.
A bit of a case study.
Yes.
And I believe this one you've got a bit of history about, something that you took through. Do you want to give us a bit of background?
Yeah.
What are we talking about today?
As some of our listeners know, over the American summer, I was over at Harvard doing an intensive course. So I thought I would share some of the learnings that I came away with, because I did learn a lot, surprisingly.
Hope so.
Yeah.
I followed you on Instagram during that period of time, and although you did seem like you were staying in the American Hogwarts,
Yeah.
it also looked highly stressful.
I didn't take a strategy course over the summer, but the course that I took has lots of strategy sort of interlaced within it. In my opinion, everything does or should. So the subject was leadership, and there is so much strategy tied up into how one might approach leading a team. So ineffective leaders so often have ineffective teams and vice versa. And one of the reasons, I believe, is because they need to rally the troops, so to speak. So if you're a leader, you need people to follow you and help you achieve your goals.
It's kind of the argument around the single savant who comes in, the rock star leadership who comes in, a board might appoint someone, may be great, but as soon as that individual leaves, the wheels might fall off a little bit. So it can't really be centered around the leader. It's very much the whole company that the leader has to do.
Yeah, and there's so many strategies that you can implement as a leader. So if we've got people listening who run their own small businesses, they lead every day. If they've got one staff member or two staff members, it doesn't really matter. They're trying to motivate people to help them achieve their goals. So it's really important that we apply strategy to it.
Leadership has so many other components around, like you might be leading your community group, you might be leading your local church group. Where we work, we have the idea of that everyone has a leadership potential or leadership, the responsibility and accountability, regardless of how you show up. So you may not be a direct manager of someone in that respect, but leadership can mean a lot of different things to different people, not just someone who has a large bunch of direct reports.
100%. There are many, many different definitions of leadership. But today we're going to compare and contrast two different leaders and look at how one went really, really well and one went really, really terribly. And we're going to look today at Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand in 2020, and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England at the same time. And we're going to look at how one was sort of a success and one was not.
One also had really poor haircuts and the other had less poor haircuts as well.
Exactly.
If we're talking about comparing and contrasting.
And when we define success, for the purpose of this episode, I'm going to define success as having their followers really commit to their strategy as opposed to not committing to the strategy that the leader proposed. As we don't usually go into politics that much in the podcast, and we normally stay in the
spicy.
Yeah, we normally stay in the lane of business leaders, but I think you can learn a lot in those moments where people are under high pressure. Also, I just want to point out that whatever your politics, whatever you think about lockdowns, sort of really has nothing to do with it, in that one was successful at achieving goals through rallying the followers and one was not, and it's very clear cut. So politics aside.
Don't at us, please.
Yeah, disclaimer. So 2020, which nobody wants to revisit, but here we go.
Do you know, very soon, 2020 is going to be 4 years ago? Isn't that crazy how time works?
Are you kidding? Oh, my God.
Yeah.
God. Well, here we go. So there was a new virus that was spreading around the world, and decisions needed to be made on how it would be addressed. So we have two world leaders in unprecedented times, as we so often referred to it as. And Ardern acted really quickly by closing the country's borders before COVID had become really too widespread. And this, for her, was a conundrum because tourism really is the backbone of New Zealand's economy. She faced some serious economic losses. But when she was faced with a choice between the immediate health and well-being of her people and a possible impact on the economy, she made her choice and the reason for her choice clear. So by the time she left the prime ministerial office in 2023, less than 2,500 COVID-19 fatalities were recorded. Now, this was the lowest COVID-related death rate in the Western world. At the same time, in the UK, it had recorded over 200,000 COVID-related deaths.
Oofed.
So there was certainly a large difference between those numbers. And some of it, I believe, came down to ethical conduct. So
acknowledging very different population as well. So
100%.
People inside London versus New Zealand. But
the population sort of doesn't really...
I think the percentages weigh out to be a lot more shocking when you look at some of the other Western nations.
100%. And the difference between 2,000 and 200,000 is statistically super significant almost regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ardern decided to choose her path based on what she believed was the greater good, so sort of that utilitarian decision. She also clearly expressed how difficult it was for her and her family too. So she was struggling. She knew how trying it would be for everyone, but ultimately it's the moral thing to do and we need to protect the vulnerable. And I think that this communication and this expression of, yes, we're all going to have a difficult time, but we're coming together to do this, it had a uniting effect on New Zealanders. And putting herself and her own family life in there really, really helped with those communications. Whereas on the other hand, Johnson's concept was aiming for herd immunity. Now, this caused serious fear and concern amongst the people, as herd immunity would only occur if many, many people died. And he openly acknowledged this as a fact. There was also a thing that was going on at the time, which was called Partygate. And for those of you who don't know and aren't already outraged, it was where the Prime Minister was caught on camera throwing a party at his residence in November of 2020, so peak COVID. And at the same time...
And he was telling everyone that they had to stay home.
Well, yeah, at the same time as this party, there were rules in effect for citizens that only 2 people could meet indoors to prevent wider spread of the virus. So you've got one Prime Minister sort of leading by example, locking down with her family, exemplifying the rules that she's sort of putting forward. And you've got another Prime Minister who's openly breaching those rules. And it was an incredible breach of trust. And an important part of leading is showing respect for people and the rules that and leading by example. And Johnson showed absolutely no respect. And it seemed that he felt that he was above the rules that everyone else sort of had to follow. And not to mention, he didn't really have much sympathy for everyone who had to die for his plan to succeed. And so what we saw from this is the confidence of his people in his leadership began to plummet. And you can see this in the polls and in sort of the media articles about Johnson at this time.
To quote Lord Farquaad from Shrek, a very, very good movie that plays quite often in my house, is some of you may die, and that is a risk he was willing to take in that space.
Exactly. Which, you know, at the time he did have some supporters in this as a strategy because economically it would push them forward because they wouldn't have to close down their businesses. But it was still quite scary to a lot of people.
And then it's coming out of Brexit. There is a lot of... 2020 was rough.
2020 was rough. Another thing about Johnson was that he was remarkably inflexible regarding new and emerging information. We remember the COVID situation was just constantly evolving, largely unknown. Everyone was facing an adaptive issue. We needed to wait for new data. We needed to wait for new expert advice that didn't exist yet. But every time new information came out, Johnson was really slow to act. And he seemed to be going against the strategies of a lot of other global leaders, which was also really interesting. And through all of this, the NHS, their public health system, was straining under the weight of the sick and the dying. And he refused to go back into lockdown for ages. He eventually did, but he was very slow to act on new information. Whereas Ardern made it very clear that protecting the population from COVID was her number one goal. She treated the process as iterative. At each stage, she checked in with her people, both in the cabinet and the populace and all her experts. And this is really, really important for a leader in these kind of evolving situations, because people begin to feel confident in a direction in each movement, and they become less nervous with each pivot, because it's like saying this strategy no longer works because I have new information. And while there is a counter side to that where people do lose confidence in a leader that's flitting around and changing direction,
stay the path kind of mentality where we're going north and we're going to keep going north until we find land, despite whirlpools and dragons and other things.
Exactly.
When you go north, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and if you communicate why you're pivoting, this raises confidence, because people see that you're making these decisions for reasons that are grounded in logic and new information, which is settling to people when new information is rising again and again and again, instead of remaining steadfast in the first decision that you made and digging your heels in and saying, no, we're still going with this one. She also ensured that she focused on how everyone held the key to the solution. So this is really big in your corporates, because if you don't let people in on the direction that you're going, then they don't come along. She was saying it's up to you to check on the ones you love, keep them safe. And like this has a really big mobilization effect. And it just ensured that everyone knew, understood the mission and their role. Whereas Johnson's communications during 2020 were actually very confusing and contradictory. Even when you look at just the tiny little small fact that at the very start, you'll remember experts were recommending the washing of hands and not touching others, just as safety measures, keep your distance. Whereas Johnson at the time was pictured frequently shaking hands with people. So, exactly. It's just that the optics are not great, and he seems to directly be going against the experts. In the meantime, almost immediately after COVID became a real threat, Ardern was running a press conference where she and her cabinet had created clear and concise alert level frameworks. She spoke openly and evenly about what that looked like, what it would mean for everybody, pointed to the data that informed the decision making. She held multiple live Facebook Q&As to help answer everyone's questions. So making herself that available as a Prime Minister was, unheard of. She elaborated why every New Zealander was important to the cause. Now, this is an example of something called relational transparency. So it's the understanding that being open and honest about the threat being faced, being clear about everyone's role in the solution, and acknowledging fears and concerns through two-way communication, not one way. It's the best way to create unity, help people cope, and motivate them towards a cause. So this is sort of where Ardern was going, and she created a space where people wanted to help and wanted to follow the rules, even though they were extremely detrimental in so many ways in terms of small businesses, people not able to go to work and being unable to provide for their families. There was a lot of downsides to this plan. But everyone knew why they were doing it, which was key in the efficacy of the New Zealanders protecting all of those citizens.
Mm.
So aside from this, Ardern just had obvious and indisputable love for her people, and it's perceived by many as very genuine. So whether they agree with her policies or not, she often ended communications with the phrase aroha from afar, which roughly means love from afar. And this authenticity and genuine care really had that a unifying effect on people. So one could argue that most effective leaders do truly care. And we've seen examples of those that are effective that clearly don't care. But the idea is that they are not as effective, or their efficacy is not sustainable because people see through it in the end. And let me tell you, people saw through Johnson. This is actually so bad, Dale. When the experts were recommending a lockdown in September of 2020 to curb the rising number of cases, Johnson was heard saying, "No more effing lockdowns. Let the bodies pile high in their thousands."
Which is never something you want to hear from a modern day Western leader. Any leader. To be really honest, it's just not something you want to hear.
No, and it's quite easy for us to sit there and be like, wow, that's outrageous. But imagine being That's your prime minister, that's your leader, that's who's looking after you and the country that you live in. Let the bodies pile high in their thousands. Like that sounds something like a Shakespearean line.
Yes, like
it's unbelievable.
Genghis Khan is not someone that many people should, like his biography is not someone that you should read when leading a modern day society. I just can't see Elbow sitting down with that book.
No. And look, it's impossible to know and understand his motivations at this time and what he was thinking, but it certainly did not feel like he was looking out for the people, and they knew it. So many of them ignored his proposal of aiming for herd immunity, and they opted to stay home and protect themselves wherever possible. Many of them left the major cities where the disease was rife, and this is critical because, again, no matter what your stance on harsh lockdowns or whatever, he couldn't get his people to follow his directive and his mission.
Yeah, regardless of, it's a good indicator that his strategy was, no, let's go out, and people were directly disobeying.
Yeah, people were following the experts, the global experts, and not their leader. So he couldn't get them to follow his directive. And how was he going to get herd immunity if the people were not willing to contract the disease and literally die to help others? He couldn't get people to subscribe to this idea. So his inability to lead the people did actually result in him being sanctioned and forced to quit office against his will. And then by comparison, Ardern voluntarily stepped down from her position at a time that was right for her. And she said as she left, "I believe that leading a country is the most privileged job anyone could ever have. You cannot and should not do it unless you have a full tank plus a bit in reserve for those unexpected challenges." And I think that statement in and of itself shows incredible insight in what it takes to lead. She's saying you are there to serve a goal and a mission, and you are there to inspire followers and motivate people to achieve goals. And this applies to businesses just as much as it does countries. And if you have not got that capacity, then you should step down as in your official sort of position. So Dale, that's my little story about two different leaders and their take on a global crisis. Let's take a little break because I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this.
Sounds good. We are back. Geez, that's a spicy, Emily.
Yeah, it's a spicy one. So obviously my opinion on this, which is based on a lot of studies that I have read and leaders I myself have examined, witnessed, worked with, etc., I sort of came to a thesis, and I believe that without a leader who is clear on goals, flexible, ethical, empathetic, and transparent, then followers will not have confidence in a mission. And then in turn, organizational effectiveness is basically impossible to achieve because the strategy cannot progress without the commitment of the followers. What are your thoughts on this, Dale?
Yeah, fine. Done. Easy. I agree.
Great.
Yes, and is probably what I'll say.
Yeah.
That I don't want to spend the whole episode backing out BJ.
Bojo.
I feel like he does a good enough job of that himself, and Jacinda, there's plenty of criticisms we can also aim at her for different things.
100%.
From a political sense. I recently read an old classic business book, Jim Collins' Good to Great, which examined companies who weren't just good, but went to great. And so they were, over a prolonged period of time, they were completely fine, but then they had hockey stick growth and beat the market for a long period of time. So there was a good academic study on businesses that were good. And what they found was this thing called a level 5 leader. And I'm going to go through the levels. You've got someone who's a highly capable individual. Is level 1. So that's the first thing that makes a good leader. I won't add any more commentary there. There's someone who's a contributing team member. So not just capable, but excellent in a team environment. You can see where there might be some ticks and crosses you might start to place against people. Someone who's a competent manager. So organizes people and resources towards the effective pursuit of predetermined objectives, which again goes very much to your clear goals.
One of those things that we discussed in class was the difference between a manager and a leader, because they are different skill sets. But I agree that managing people does go under the umbrella of leadership, 100%.
Correct. And when you've got an environment as complex as as a government or a parliament that you're trying to coordinate a response in something that there is no rule book for. You can understand why competent management may be effective. Level 4 is they're an effective leader, which I think is something that we've established is maybe there's varying levels of effectiveness on both sides. And the final thing the book acknowledges that most people top out at level 4. And they go, cool, that's fine. They are excellent leaders. They're excellent managers. They contribute to the team and they're bloody good at what they do. The thing that kind of makes the level 5 executive and what really reminded me about this is the quote from Jacinda around having your tank full is that you need to build enduring greatness through a blend of personal humility and professional will, which for the most part means you're not there having a press conference and going, I am great, look at what I've done, this is excellent. What you're doing is, but you're letting the goal speak for itself. You're putting in the effort to make sure that the greater good or the company succeeds enduring past yourself. You may retire, but when you retire, that company will kick on because what you've set up will endure beyond you. It's where something around politics is interesting around a lot of these terms that you're in. And you can be a prime minister indefinitely, so you can just keep getting voted in, but every 3 years that changes. The strategy that comes in those politics is that you're going to deliver a 3-year strategy. And so maybe that 1.5-year mark, you stop focusing on the work because you're focusing on the next strategy. So you're setting those things up, or the other parties coming in to start their strategy. And so the policy starts to align that way.
This is when you start as well to get, when you get like conservative, then left-leaning, conservative, left-leaning.
Pendulum.
We get nothing done. This is what we're seeing in the American politics in particular at the moment. It's just swinging back and forth because everyone's just spending the first part of their term undoing everything that the last person did.
If you look at it from a point of view of maybe you're a leader going in on a 2-year contract, a level 5 leader suggests that you should go in and not do something that's going to make you look great. So deliver one great project and move on. You're very much there to deliver enduring value to that company, maybe even beyond you. And I feel like a lot of Jacinda's overall vision and mission was very much cool. Well, the greater good here is for humans to live on beyond me, not just for us to navigate this from an economic sense. And I think so much of what the response to COVID came in was a tension between the economics and people who are very much losing their jobs and they need money and need to feed their family, and the public health response. And by no means am I a public health expert, and there's we're still learning about public health and those who, as part of the public, have been impacted by that.
Well, I got so impacted by my thoughts about public health and public health policy that I moved into public health as a career after COVID. So it definitely had because it was so much in the zeitgeist, and for the first time we were able to see extremely clearly the people who were making the choices for us on our health and well-being. I think it impacted a lot of people.
I like to comment around a politician's role isn't to take the advice of one view. So I think a lot of the criticism that was leveled at where we were, Dan Andrews, was that he was taking the advice very much of the chief health officer versus the wide view that he maybe should have taken. Part. And I think that goes back to your comment around flexibility. I loved when people leveled at them. They're just making it up as they go along. Yes, they are. And they kind of have to in this space. And so that's where flexibility is important.
I think that flexibility is that you don't move the goalposts. The goalposts stay the same. Your pathway to those goalposts change when you receive new information. So let's take public health off the table and talk about building a product. If you are engineering a product, your goal is to create something that functions in this way. But if you're working along and you're like, yep, we're going to use this material to do it, but then you realize, oh, that material burns too hot and so it's going to fall apart in like this sort of at the very simplistic level, then you're like, okay, we might want to investigate a new material. I'm still trying to create this product that I've always said I'm going to try and create, but I'm going to try it a different way because we've made discoveries that it doesn't work. So I think that when you think of someone who's backflipping and going and changing, they're actually moving the goalposts, which is very disruptive.
I think that links nicely to that point around transparency as well. I think if there is that transparency that comes down, again, in very clear, understandable language, because there is huge amounts of swathes of data that you must be understanding in building a product, being able to create those decisions and still go back to those goalposts with the transparent and clear information that is required is important.
I also think transparency is really interesting because there's so much literature around transparency. We all know and understand that transparency is extremely important. And yet there are so many people who do not follow a transparent leadership style and they keep everything close to their chest. We know that leaders who go, yeah, we're in a crisis. We are. And here's my strategy to get through it. It's going to be hard. I don't know. I do not have all the answers, but this is what we're going to try and we're going to try it together. I'd much rather follow that guy than the one that, don't worry, everything's fine. Nothing to see here.
Can I add a counterpoint there around, I'm not going to counter transparency. I think what is humbling to leaders is that when they are overly transparent, they don't get plaudits and thank yous for so much for everything you've told me. Because sometimes that transparent information maybe isn't understood in the way it is meant to.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't actually bring comfort.
I think that that's a really valid point because we do, as humans, tend to overcorrect in a lot of ways in terms of we're like, okay, I'm going to be really transparent. I am distressed. Like, that's not exactly what that means. You still need to show up and have a meltdown, have a breakdown with your partner, whatever it is. But when you show up to the people who are following you, you need to be able to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, but in a way that's calm and concise. You don't dwell on it. You let them know. So then they go, oh, human, they're human. And here is how I would like to address it. Does anyone have any ideas?
Just giving you that feedback loop,
yes.
Which I think is an excellent way in that transparency and everything else you're doing around the direction you're setting. You're listening and understanding how your words and how your actions are having impact in that environment, which I think for me, the takeaway for this is listen, validate, and use with your own information. Well, there's some leaders who get the trap of over-listening. Usually the people you're listening to are sometimes the loudest, the squeakiest wheels. And in listening to the squeakiest wheels, you may not be hearing from a cohort that is representative of what you're trying to move or achieve. And so I think listening, 100% yes, but making sure you're getting a balanced nutritional or informational diet as it's coming through as well. You had a point in there around ethics. I'm not even going to touch it.
I think the ethical's an interesting point because do you need to be ethical to be an effective leader? And I think, no, you don't. But if you're not, you cannot sustain that leadership and you're probably not going to be working towards a mission that is valuable or impactful on the people around you. And then therefore, your mission is not going to be able to move forward.
By no means saying that any of our mining or resource companies are unethical by respect. I think they've had a lot of growing up in the past few years, but I would be interested around some of those comments we may explore later in this season. Your final comment was empathy. And this is a fun one because, sure, I want my leaders to be empathetic. I think in some spaces, empathy is confused with weakness. I think understanding what that leader stands for and what that business stands for and where they may be empathetic towards.
I also think we can look at empathy from a cynical perspective as well, in that, let's say someone has empathy and so therefore understands what motivates their staff, what people need to achieve, how people communicate, and so therefore can communicate with them more effectively. So like all of these skills, empathy doesn't necessarily just mean like, oh, your dog died and I feel empathy for you, and so you can have the afternoon off. It also means I know how you communicate. I understand where you're coming from. And so I can connect with you in a way to then motivate you to move towards my goal.
I had a really interesting aha moment this year. I was undergoing one of the leadership training session. And I often thought empathy was a very emotional response. If you split people into people who are very emotional driven versus very fact driven, unsurprisingly, I'm quite fact and data driven. Give me my line charts to tell me where the story is. And I was informed that empathy is actually quite a data driven response because you're receiving the input and going, cool, this is what's happening. I'm going to feel like this for you. And so it's very much taking it in.
Interesting.
And it's a conscious effort to make that decision to feel empathy versus other components which are very much I'm feeling with you. I'm here and I was like, I
think that's so interesting because there's different ways that people tap into things. We talked a lot about in the leadership about preferences and like your preference into how you lead. And so if your preference is logic and graphs, you might have someone on your team who does not have that as a preference. So then how you communicate with that person is really important, and how you pivot and you discuss things. And I think what you just mentioned is a really interesting way for someone who's really logic driven to tap into someone who's very emotive driven. I think that's very interesting, and I've never heard that.
It was my one element to prove to myself that I wasn't a complete robot. I was like, I'm incredibly empathetic. To which the facilitator told me, oh, no, that's a logic response. Don't worry. You're still a robot. And I was like,
oh, damn. Next time. You'll get him next time, Val.
Well, listeners, there you have it. Now you understand a little bit more of the con. We hope that you avoid using Genghis Khan as a leadership mentor, particularly when dealing with public health in the future.
That was very good, Dale.
I feel a bit yuck about it. Lucky I'm not.
No, I loved it. I was here for it.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Big Con podcast. Not only supports us, but means you'll get the latest episodes straight to your device of choice. We are on all your favourite podcast platforms, including YouTube and TikTok. Do not keep all the fun to yourself. Please share the con around to your mother, your aunts, your best friend's brother. Tell them to check us out on all your favourite podcast apps or their favourite podcast apps. For any further details, head over to our website, thebigconsultingagency.com, and sign up to the mailing list. Emily, thank you very much.
Thanks. That was fun.
Bye for now.
Bye.